Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your warm welcome. I know that they have kind of hoo-hooed a little bit, but if I could get the Canadians that came with me just to stand for a minute, because I want you to look at them. These are some of the dearest people to me in this whole world, and I feel so honored to be able to have them with me and to share them with you. And also my consecrating bishop is here, Bishop Ron Kuykendall, who has been incredibly instrumental to our journey. We got to know each other. We were students at Oxford University. He was doing his doctorate there in the Oxford movement, and he has been a real coach in many ways, and a doctor of the soul, really, to me, and just helped in my journey and in my healing process. And so anyways, he's back there. Maybe he'd give us a little wave, Ron and Susie. They have traveled so many times to our city and to our little movement, and we would just not be where we are today if it was not for them. A little bit about my story. I was quite a new Christian. I was 18 years of age, first year of theological college, and I had this sense this weekend that something was going to happen that was going to affect the course of my life. A British evangelist visited the college that weekend. He was a member of the European Billy Graham team. And here I was, 17, 18, fairly new Christian, not really understanding completely how things work in the church. And the Lord pointed me out to him in a crowd. And he met with me afterwards and asked me if I would move to England at the close of that year. So I did that. I moved there lock, stock, and barrel at the age of 18. I was acted as a kind of understudy to him to study, train in the ministry in a kind of mentoring relationship. I moved into their house. I lived in the attic, which can be kind of cold and musty sometimes in Britain. And I ate around their table. And something happened almost from the onset of that time. That man had spent 25 years doing that. One person after another, training, mentoring at great personal expense. And there was something from his spiritual genetic code that came into me. I feel it was like God was honoring the cost he had paid for young leaders and wanted to make sure that that did not die with him. And so I don't remember that ever being a part of my life before that year. And yet from the time I was 18 till now, that has been one of the most dominant parts of my life. And so I want to make sure I mention him. His name is Dr. Tony Stone. Sorry, didn't expect that. That's a long time ago now. And Christian leaders don't just appear. They are the product of much love and great investment. And I'm very thankful for those that God has sent who have invested so heavily into me. John Stuart Mill, in his work on liberty, talks about a concept that has become very important to me. He talks about this phrase, the soil in which geniuses grow. And of course, he considers that a society that places a high premium on liberty. But I've borrowed that concept, and for years I've been applying that truth to Christian leadership development and asking myself the question, what is the soil in which world-class, world-changing Christian leaders grow? And how do we cultivate that kind of soil in our movements? Because you can plant things in soil, or you can go a step further, you can actually create soil. You can compose or compost soil. So how do we create the kind of soil in which Christian leaders would grow? The Great Commission, of course, is a suitable starting place. For 35 years now, I've been weighing this passage, and every time I go back to it, I still feel like it has so much more to give me than I have yet tapped. Of course, the famous passage contains the command of Jesus to make disciples, but I want to take you beyond the command, and that is some of the teaching in it regarding the how to make disciples. It's more than just something that compels us to make disciples. There's actually teaching in the passage that gives away some of the secrets. In verses 16 to 17 of that famous passage, Jesus came and he speaks about the 11 disciples. Jesus came to the 11 disciples. And yet in the very next couple of verses, he says to that group, go and make disciples. So get the juxtaposition. He came to disciples and said, go make disciples. What could he mean by that? But go do for others now what I've just been doing for you with the last 3.5 years. And so there's an imperative to study, how did Jesus train disciples? What were some of the strategies that he used? How did he cultivate leaders in his midst? And what could we learn from that? So first, when I think of Jesus' earthly ministry, I think of a series of concentric circles. So William Glass has created a little image for me, because the truth is I really don't know how to make these for myself. That's not it. It's coming. Okay. He's doing this to make me pay so that next time I do it by myself. All right. There you go. Thank you, William. A series of concentric circles with the 12. You'll remember the 7 sending out of the 70. Acts chapter 1 speaks about 120 gathered in the upper room, and then, of course, there's the multitudes. A couple of questions I want to ask about this, though, is how did Jesus prioritize these groups? You all got priorities in your life and ministry, and there's a managing of different groups and a managing of different affairs. How did he manage these different groups? I'm going to argue that the smallest circle here received the greatest priority, which could sound counterintuitive to us. Why wouldn't you give the largest attention to the largest group? But I'm convinced he did the opposite. And that his strategy was to reach the larger circles by investing most heavily in the smaller circles, which raises some more questions. How exactly did he do that? How do we replicate this aspect of Jesus' ministry, leadership development? How do we create a culture of this in our churches and in our movements? And what would it mean to have a culture of that? What would be the marks of such a culture? I want to offer a couple suggestions to you. Maybe we would think of them as culture creators. Number one, the importance of initiating or taking the initiative. Jesus said to the disciples before they were even disciples, come follow me. That is at the very heart of the gospel. Theologically, we call this the doctrine of prevenient grace. In summary form, it says this: man cannot seek God until God has first sought the man. That God is always the initiator, the first mover. And if that is our message, then it has to be reflected in our method. Come follow me. He pursued them. Practically, it means the willingness to reach out. The willingness to take the first step, to extend the hand, to take the initiative, to see things in people before they see things in themselves. Imagine the original fishermen in a boat. By this time, Jesus had become something of a local celebrity. They were still working out exactly his identity. But they realized at a very early stage, at least, this was a very special man raised up by God, possibly the Messiah, doing feats that can only be explained in terms of the miraculous. And one day he comes to the water's edge and speaks to fishermen in a boat, come follow me. And the question is, what must have struck them? Because this is the last thing that they expected waking up that morning, is that this holy man, become a local celebrity, possibly the Messiah, would show the least bit of interest in them. And so though he only says those few words, come follow me, the question is, what is implied in those words? I think what they must have felt is, he wants me? Doesn't he know who we are? He wants me? He values me? He has the option. He can choose anybody he wants, and he's choosing me. He sees me. He notices me. He sees something in me. He thinks I'm worth it. He wants my company. He asked them to come and be with me. He's not just assigning me to a duty. He wants me to be with him where he is. And the list could go on. All the things that they would have felt at a heart level that were implied in those three simple words. And so fulfilling the Great Commission is cultivating a culture where we make our young leaders feel what Jesus made those young leaders feel on that day. Where we have a culture where our young leaders feel, I'm wanted, I'm seen, I'm valued. People see things in me that I don't yet see in myself. They want me, they like my company, and think that life would be better with me around. Fulfilling the Great Commission. So, first culture creator is taking the initiative. If that man had not looked out in a crowd, allowed God to direct his attention my way, took the initiative, invited me. I would never have invited myself. I'm not that kind. I could never have said, Dr. Stone, would you mind if I travel to Britain and train with you? And he took me in the initiative, and I was able to take the other counter side of the gospel. I was able to show gospel response. Come follow me. And I was able to respond in faith and recognize God in that moment. Second culture creator is intimacy. There is a word in the Gospels that somehow allures us in ministry. It attracts us. It's a word that is found in this concentric circle, and it's not usually the word 12, it's the word multitudes, or modern translation would have the crowds. It kind of allures us because we think that's where ministry is. That would make us feel like a success if we were attracting crowds. Who wouldn't want to do that? But make no mistake, Jesus reserved the very best parts of himself, not for the crowds. They brushed up against him. Some of the greatest miracles were people who enjoyed incidental contact, brushed up against him, and wonderful miracles took place. But the disciples didn't just brush up against him. They received the very best part of him, and he reserved it for them. The Messiah, the Son of God, creator of the universe, wanted to give the very best part of himself to 12 guys that didn't think they even mattered. We're still so preoccupied by multitudes. It's very beautiful to me. They saw him pray. They saw him weep. They saw him anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane. In public he taught, but in private he explained. And the list could go on of the privileges they received. Hear the words of St. Paul on this matter. He says to the church in Thessalonica, we loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our own lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. We loved you so much that we were delighted to give you the gospel, but we were delighted to share our very lives with you. So, fulfilling the Great Commission entails inviting young leaders into your world and even into your heart. Fulfilling the Great Commission entails making them your top priority, second only to prayer. If I have this right, that during the earthly ministry of Jesus, second only to communion with the Father, was those 12 guys. Then what does that look like in my life? People have asked me sometimes, what are your passions? I say, I could give you the answer, or you could look in my diary and you'd see the truth. Because in my diary, you will see, in my personal organizer, you will see what I give the lion's share of my time and heart to. And that will tell a greater story than my words will. Where I invest most heavily. Fulfilling the Great Commission entails seeking to know and to be known, which can be scary for older leaders. Because if I'm going to be known, they're going to know it all. They're going to know my fears, my insecurities, my sins, my weaknesses, my failures. Some of them will manage that well, and some will manage it poorly. But if we're going to build community instead of fantasy, then knowing each other deeply is important. Otherwise, it's just a fantasy. It's a Disney flick. And you can edit out the tough parts. So fulfilling the Great Commission entails doing life with our young leaders, not just doing ministry with them. Lastly, intentionality. When I take a look at how Jesus managed the disciples, how he worked with them, I don't see something that is random, but something that is strategic, deliberate, and highly intentional. But I've noticed my time is gone, and so I'm going to leave you guessing about intentionality. Always leave them asking for more. Thank you.